Okay, we managed to overcome the technical difficulties of running this, so I'll run it through a couple of times. It's in real time. It happened very quickly. We were told by one of the observers on site that it sounded like a gigantic car crash, which surprised me a bit. I thought it would sound more like a roar, but I've never heard one, so I don't really know. There's no sound on this. Now, what you see, that's mainly dust and some sort of water spray as well, going higher than the dam. I'll just run this back again. You'll notice that there are a couple of rigs on the side, on the face of the dam as well. They perished. One at the top and one at the middle. We believe they were installing horizontal drains at the time, but it seems it was a bit late. So the dam was 80 metres high. The wave that came out was up to 30 metres high. 30 metres high. And if you imagine there was a, let's say the dam here, the water dam there, the plant over here, so it actually had to do a right angle bend to get down the valley. So it rode up on the water dam to the right-hand side and threatened the stability of that, overlapped part of the plant, overlapped the stockpile area, which you might have seen the movie of, a bit further downstream, and then reverted to the other side of the valley where the canteen was and took out the canteen. There's nothing to see. There's absolutely nothing left of the canteen. Not much left of the stockpile either. And once the dust settled, that's what it looked like. Now, there is another video that shows it from the other side, and it reveals that, in fact, the initial failure was quite shallow. And in fact, the face of the upstream raises were quite shallow. They didn't go back very far into the dam at all. So the initial failure was a shallow failure, but then you had a regressive failure, a bit like a sinkhole develops. So you had an almost vertical scarp with the bottom flowing out. And probably 85% of the tailings went by that mechanism, just kept regressing back. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about key life cycle tailings management risks, and a bit about the way forward, or a way forward. So risk assessments of tailings dams are commonplace, but how well are they done? And even if you make that risk assessment quantitative, because how many in the audience are engineers? So actually less than I thought, maybe about 20%. But engineers like numbers. We don't like words so much. So we would rather do what we think is a quantitative risk assessment by assigning numbers. We'll typically assign numbers, say, from 1 to 5. And then hidden behind those numbers, 1 to 5, we'll have order of magnitude probability of failure. So we might say that 1 is rare, so its probability is 1 in 1,000. 3 to 5 might be almost certain, and that might be 1 in 10, 1 in 10 per year. But those numbers are all arbitrary. So you might fool yourself into thinking that you're coming up with a quantitative risk assessment result, but it's actually still fairly qualitative. It's relative. It's actually a relative risk assessment that we typically do. The biggest problem, though, is not just the risk assessments, it's defining what is acceptable. That's a bigger problem because it's subjective. Everyone has a different idea of what is acceptable or not. But I think you'd have to agree that two major tailings dam failures per year worldwide is unacceptable. I think you'd have to agree. And in fact, it's probably the biggest threat to the mining industry right now. The approaches to tailings management need to improve. Tailings minimisation and dewatering needs to be pursued. We need greater reliability and resilience in our design, construction, operation and closure. We need to monitor better. So how many people have at their tailings dam sites, if they know, real-time monitoring of piezo levels? And how many are not? So the ones who are not, what are you typically reading? Once a month? Yep. You saw how quickly that failure took place. Seconds. Once a month won't tell you anything. You need not only real time, you need a very high frequency. So it turns out that it appears that the piezo data for the site that just failed, they had real-time monitoring, but they're only reading it once a day. And as far as I can see so far, there's no usable data from that. It wouldn't have told them anything. So you need to be monitoring real time and continuously. I would say, why not read? If the device is capable of reading almost continuously, do that. And then you need to link that to triggers. So green for safe operation, amber for requiring assessment by a geotech engineer, and red initiating the emergency response plan. Which tailing site in the world do you think is now the best monitored? Have a guess. Oh, Cadia's pretty good, yeah. But before Cadia, it was Samarco. Not before the failure, after the failure. After the horse had bolted, once the tailings dam had gone, Samarco became easily the best monitored tailings dam site in the world. They had 6 radars, normally reserved for slope instability. They had, on the dams they had left, they probably more than doubled their piezometer installations, made them all real time. They have video surveillance. That's probably where the idea came from at the recent failure to put in videos. And it's all controlled by a central control room. It has trigger levels. It has emergency responses, etc. Very different from what occurred before the failure. I'll say a bit about liquefaction because it's become such a buzzword that people are required to consider. So the risk of earthquake-induced liquefaction relies on fine-grained, sandy or silty sand tailings. They typically are. Metalliferous tailings are typically made to be that size. They would need to be loose. And there are other words that are bandied around, not just loose, but contractive or brittle. Contractive meaning that they collapse when you load them. But I think the best term is actually loose. It's a nice, simple term to think of. You're on the loose side of where you should be. They're typically loose because they're deposited as a slurry. They're allowed to settle out. They're still loose. No compaction is usually undertaken. Near saturated. Most tailings are near saturated, at least during operation. And you need an earthquake magnitude greater than about 5.5, which is equivalent to a peak ground acceleration of greater than about 0.13 G. Now, most sites would have done a seismic risk assessment. You'd know what your G levels, your estimated G levels are. They're only estimated because we haven't had a lot of earthquakes in Australia. 5.5 and 0.13 G is about the earthquake that hit Newcastle in 1989. And it's believed that caused some liquefaction of potentially liquefiable materials. A little bit maybe, was it Hamilton or Hamilton Street? Hamilton, I think, suffered some. And even as far away as Scone had some sandy deposits that they believe liquefied. So it's about the boundary. Now the risk of static, or some people call it flow liquefaction, needs a trigger. So it could be triggered by a loss of containment due to dam instability. They lose the dam, the tailings behind liquefy. They've got no support. It could be overtopping an erosion of the dam. So Mount Polly, for example, the tailings liquefied, but the cause was not that. The cause was the loss of freeboard on the dam. The dam slid on a weaker foundation, one they didn't realise was there. It lost a bit of freeboard. There was water against that part of the dam. It overtopped. It eroded the dam. And then the tailings behind flowed out. So the tailings liquefied, but the cause was actually the movement of the dam. If you hadn't had water against the dam at that location, you wouldn't have had the failure they observed. You wouldn't have had liquefaction. You could have pore water pressure increased due to a dam raise. So the pore pressure is induced by putting a dam raise on top of tailings, particularly if it's upstream. So to give you an idea, if there's no drainage of the tailings that are loaded by a raise, and let's say the raise is 2 metres, then it could induce, the stress induced by 2 metres raise would be about 40 kPa. If there's no drainage of pore pressures immediately, you will induce 40 kPa increase in pore pressure. That's 4 metres rise in head, 4 metres. Have a check of your stability calculations, and if you put your water table 4 metres higher, would it still stand up? Just to give you a bit of an idea. And we know that, I know from experience of a particular site, that typically the tailings don't drain quickly enough to relieve that increase in pore pressure due to the embankment raise on top of them, or even sometimes not entirely on top of them, partly on top of the existing embankment. So you do induce that sort of, if you raise it by 3 metres, you can add 6 metres of head immediately. Or you could have a rise in the phreatic surface due to heavy rainfall or fresh tailings. So a storm event or fresh tailings. So susceptible tailings can behave in an undrained, contractive, strain softening, just means they take off, and liquefy or flow. So many tailings would be susceptible under those sorts of conditions. Now, we haven't had to worry about it in Australia in the past because we considered we're a low seismic risk country, though we therefore didn't have to worry about it. There have been very few tailings dam failures in Australia. So Katie's the most recent. I'm only aware of about another 2 or 3 in my lifetime. So there haven't been many. So we're sort of relying on that to support our argument. So the tailings state, loose or dense, in situ, in the ground, in the tailings dam, is difficult to determine, particularly if the tailings are loose. You can't sample them. They just flow out of the sample tube, even with a piston sample. CPT data plot in the bottom left-hand corner of the chart, about which we know nothing. It's the bottom left-hand corner of the chart, and we have no data for it. It's got a certain classification, but we have no data for it. It doesn't give us any indication of what the properties are like. Some use is made of the standard penetration test, but we don't do that in tailings. We might do that for foundation investigations. Some use is made of the simple shear test, but samples may not represent the in situ state. How do you get a sample? If you can't easily sample it, how do you get a sample to be representative of the condition in the ground? By the way, the simple shear test is, some people would know about the direct shear test, which is shearing this way. Simple shear is essentially shearing like that. Some people call it, in fact, one of the manufacturers of the simple shear device call it a DSS, or a direct simple shear. That's even worse than static liquefaction. It can't be direct and simple. It's either direct or simple. So what they're actually talking about is a simple shear device. They've just misnamed it. They put the D in there and it shouldn't be there. So in the absence of laboratory test data, and they're still difficult to get, post-liquefaction shear strength may be estimated based on correlations between liquefaction case studies, notably mainly in natural soils, and the cone resistance. So that's also important. It's not only the fact that it might liquefy, it's what strength it might have after liquefaction. So you could have a body of tailings liquefy, but the dams still remain intact, but the tailings are now weakened, and that might lead to a failure of the dam. So you need to know something about the post-liquefaction strength as well. Geotechnical closure risks and challenges for TSFs. You've got dam geotechnical instability. And I've made this point. I actually wrote this, I think, initially before the failure. I've got a feeling I made it. Anyway, tailings are expected to drain down on cessation of deposition, but they may be recharged by high rainfall if they're not discharged via a spillway. So of the TSF operators here, how many of them have a spillway? How many don't have a spillway? Don't have a spillway. Okay. If you're trying to design in perpetuity, I don't think you can get away without having a spillway. If you can't take your spillway through natural ground, it's going to be very difficult to construct a spillway across a tailings dam without, potentially failing or threatening the dam itself. Dam erosional instability, particularly in a dry climate if the slope is flattened and topsoiled. Now that may go counter to what a lot of people think. Dam erosional instability, not just geotechnical. So if you have a dam of a given height and you make the slope flatter, you've made the catchment bigger. If you take it from 2 to 1 to 4 to 1, you've doubled the length of the slope. The height's still the same, so the length of the slope is now double. Not only that, you would have quite likely dozed it off, so you've made it smoother. If you had any coarse elements on your surface texture, they would be buried or crushed. So you've now made a smoother surface, twice as long, so the runoff will be higher than you had before. Less will go into the slope. So you've now made it longer, more erodible, higher runoff. Now the other thing you'd then do, possibly because you want to vegetate it, you'll put the most erodible material you can find, topsoil, fine-grained topsoil, a layer of that on the top so that you can vegetate it. Nature will correct that mistake. Nature will wash the topsoil down to the bottom and you'll end up with not a linear slope, but a concave one, and all that bottom wedge will be topsoil. Now, the only place where that might not be the case would be if you had consistently good rainfall, good soils and good rainfall, consistent rainfall, not heavy rainfall, the sort of rainfall we get in Australia. We get intense storms. So it's quite likely you will erode faster than you can vegetate. And even if you look at a slope flat on, you'll see that. You'll see the gullies forming. If you look at it from the side, oh, that looks pretty good. Nice grass cover across it if you look side on, because it's obscuring those gullies that are forming, or the rills that are forming. Now, if you think geotech engineering is imprecise, the estimation of erosion loss is far more imprecise. So geotechnical parameters, let's take friction angle's not too bad. You can probably get friction angle within plus or minus 3 degrees. Cohesion is not so good. It might be plus or minus 50%. But erosion loss estimation is probably at least plus or minus 100%, and possibly worse. Universal soil loss equation, does that ring a bell with people? Who's heard of that? It was developed in Purdue University. It's almost dead flat. It's cropping country. It's consistent rainfall. It does snow in the winter, so nothing much happens then. So for half the year, it's got fairly consistent rainfall. It's cropping country. The slopes are less than 2%. And we've extrapolated that to mine slopes. It's rubbish. Rubbish. If you look at what is the only way you can get an angle of repose rock slope to erode? The only way you can get it to erode? By creating a cut in your safety berm or your windrow at the top. You make a cut in it so that you force the flow to go down. That will erode it. But if you don't have that, it won't erode. And if it does erode at all, the fines will go into the rock. Most of it will go into it rather than run off. So you'll get very little erosion. And we replace that. We doze that off. We doze a slope like that off to half or less angle of repose. In the process, we make the slope twice as long. We make it flatter by burying or crushing the coarse material. The runoff goes up, and then we make the mistake of putting topsoil on top, and we expect it to stand up to erosion. It won't. Differential settlement, affecting the slope profile and drainage. Poor quality water, so it could be saline, it could be acidic, it could be alkaline. There will be a lag. There's always some lag because a variety of reasons. It might be because your process involves the addition of lime, so you're actually adding some alkalinity to the process. So it'll take a finite time to use that up before any acid-producing materials produce acid. There's also a hydrological lag, so it takes a finite time for the water to get through and actually generate that acid drainage. You've got ponded water, runoff leading to ponding below the dump. We've got dump here, I actually meant to say tailing slope, emerging at the low points around the toe. So inevitably your tailing storage, or a dump for that matter, will sit on natural terrain. There will be buried drainage channels underneath it. They're still there. And anything that does go through either comes from above the tailings dam or goes through the base of the tailings dam will follow those drainage channels and come out at low points along the toe of the tailings dam. And you'll get possibly infiltrating to groundwater. So it won't only necessarily affect the surface water, it may affect the groundwater as well. In areas of particularly steep terrain, like Chile, they get situations where seepage goes into the ground, comes back out again, affects the surface, goes back into the ground, because they've got this enormous topographic relief. In Australia, once it comes to the surface, it typically stays there. Or once it goes underground, it typically stays there. We don't have enough topographic relief to have that seepage re-emerge and then bury itself again. Few tailing storage facilities have successfully been rehabilitated, with reprocessing and in-pit disposal increasingly being considered. Because it's, for one thing, it's cheaper than trying to cover a large tailings footprint. But you might also get some benefit from reprocessing. You won't make enough out of the reprocessing to fully pay for removing the tailings, but it'll help. It'll be cheaper than the option of covering. Regulatory requirements. So this social and financial licenses to operate, they're increasingly under high threat. And I can't see that getting any better. I think the industry needs to do some serious work on trying to improve their reputation. There's this lack of trust. Mount Polly in a pristine British Columbia, and they had a tailings dam failure. The loss of trust over that was enormous. How could this happen? Bias. Everyone brings bias to a discussion, and this tends to discourage innovation and improvement. So try and park the biases and think laterally about what other solutions you might come up with. Now, the regulators love the idea of progressive mine closure, but it needs to be genuinely upfront of mind. You need to take the case of a highway. We're going to build a highway from point A to point B. We'll look at all the alternative routes. We'll look at topographic relief. We'll look at cut fill. We'll look at land ownership, land occupation. We'll take into account certain protest groups that are louder than others. And we'll come up with an optimal route. We'll do a virtual flyover of that. In the old days, we would have built a model. We'll build a virtual flyover. We'll sell that to the stakeholders. We'll get it accepted. Not everyone will be happy. The people who will use the road will be happy. People whose properties are incised by the road won't be so happy. But it'll be agreed, and we'll know before we even start, before we even turn any dirt, we'll know exactly how it'll look at the end, and we'll go ahead and do it. Think of the contrast with mining. Mining typically doesn't investigate fully the ore body before they start. They investigate it just enough to say they've got a viable resource. They start the mine. You ask them, in 5 years' time, how will this look? How will this site look? I have no idea, if they're being honest. I have no idea. Head office hasn't told us. You go to head office and you ask them, oh no, it's up to the sites to decide what this might look like in 5 years' time. You ask, what would it look like at closure? Well, we can't tell you that. Rise and fall of commodity prices, all these balls we're juggling in the air, we have no idea. I think the mining industry needs to get a better idea of what their final landform might look like. We had final landform brought up earlier. You need to have some idea of where you're heading to be able to get there. Otherwise, you'll have no hope of ever getting there. And you can't just go to no care and no maintenance. Can you? Regulators in the future won't let you. There is a range of government departments that should be engaged. It's not just the regulators. So think about who will be the future government custodian of the land if you manage to relinquish it. It won't be the regulator, it'll be the lands department, or who will it be in New South Wales? Depends what the lease is. If it's a pastoral lease, it might be the lands department or something equivalent. Go and talk with them. So there's an interesting exercise done by BHP Nickel West. They, after Samarco, BHP instituted this system where all their major potential costs, if they were an expenditure bigger than an estimated 250 million US, they had to cost them. So they went through this exercise of if they were to close Nickel West, what would be the cost and how would they go about it? A very good paper was given by the guy who led this in mine closure last year. And they first of all decided, well, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? What would you say? Yell out a word, one word. Relinquishment. But sometimes you forget that. So they decided, we're going to go for relinquishment. That's what our aim is. So they decided on that. They then thought, well, if we manage to get relinquishment, who will be the custodian of the land? And they decided it would be the lands department in WA. So they went and saw them. It was the first time anyone from the mining industry had sought an audience with the lands department, and they were delighted. It was very positive. Then they thought about our agreed post-mining land use is grazing. This is in the middle of they get about 200 mil of rain a year. So they had some experts study how many cattle they could run on their total acreage. I don't know, it was 5,000 hectares or something or other, a very large area. And they came up with a figure, 30. So they said, this is silly. They took the lands department. They agreed it was silly. So they're not doing that anymore. They've changed their agreed land use. It's not going to be grazing. It's going to be native habitat. So, they went through this process of seriously addressing it. And I think the problem often with closure is we focus on what we think is the answer or what we think is expected to be the answer, like it could be grazing or whatever, rather than addressing the question. So make sure you focus on the question. Governments are moving to have rehabilitation bank guarantee amounts paid to them for abandoned sites. Has that happened in New South Wales yet? You're going that way? But is it going to you? You hold it, yeah. So WA's gone that way. I think they were the first. You've gone that way here. Queensland's going that way or has gone that way. So the bank guarantee that you previously... Okay, that's different in Queensland and WA. Queensland and WA are using those funds to treat abandoned sites. So they're treating the sins of the past using the money that's coming in now. And I guess they're hoping that mining will go on forever, because otherwise the sins of the future won't be covered. Now, bank guarantee. So I thought, this is interesting. I'll find out how much is the bank guarantee. So I went to Google, because that's a source of all knowledge. And I found a number of banks offering bank guarantees. So I sent emails to them, and most of them just ignored me, wouldn't give me a rate. I was after a rate. What is the rate? And they wouldn't give it to me, they just ignored me. But one of them must have thought I was a potential customer. So he told me the rate. He said, well, if you're a top tier mining company, it will be about 1.5% of the agreed value. If you're a lesser one, it might be 3%. And if you're really dodgy, we won't give it to you. So that's the sort of range, 1.5 to 3%. So you're putting in 1.5 to 3% of the regulator estimated financial assurance amount, or security deposit, or whatever you want to call it. I'll get onto that later. Here, I'll get onto it with this slide. So interestingly, in Queensland and New South Wales, that figure's the same. If you go through it, they call it something different, whether it's a security deposit or a financial assurance calculated amount. So for tailings, it's actually the same whether it's waste rock or tailings. The figure is between about $85,000 a hectare and about $215,000 a hectare, if you sum all the different components together. The $85,000 end is where you've got relatively inert tailings that behave quite well physically as well. So they're not acid generating, and they settle quite well. The other end of the range is where you've got problematic tailings. That's the figure. So you make 1.5 to 3% of that per year. Now, there have been very few tailings dams that have actually been rehabilitated, but I've been involved in a couple that have been done in Queensland at the New Acland site. So people know the New Acland site? They've been fighting three successive governments to get an approval to go ahead with an expansion. Each time they almost get there, there's a change of government. They have to start again. Anyway, they're still fighting that, but they thought, as a measure of good faith, and by the way, they own the land privately. So it's not a lease. They have a mining lease, but they own the land. And as a sign of good faith, they decided they would rehabilitate their surface tailings storage and one of their in-pit ones, just to demonstrate they could do it to a high level. And I got involved in that process. And I can tell you it cost them at the bottom end of that range. So if you're assessed at being the top end of that range, then your 1.5 to 3% is 1.5 to 3% of twice the amount. So it's actually become significant. You can't write it off in terms of net present value. It becomes significant. So after a number of years, you've actually paid the total amount that you would have spent on rehab, but you haven't done anything. You've just made the banks a bit richer. This one. So we're going to lock a key government, high-level government person and a high-level company person in a room until they come up with an agreed closure cost in today's dollars. And let's say that figure's 100 million. They're desperate to get out of the room, so they agree to 100 million. But how do those two groups treat it? Well, if you ask the regulator, they may not have heard of a discount factor, and they're not too sure what they do with the money over time. Would we inflate it by something, maybe CPI? The miner, on the other hand, knows exactly what he'll do with today's amount of money. He's going to discount it over time. This is what the regulator does. He'll add CPI. Let's say it's 2%. And let's say, well, we'll look at a 50-year time frame, because we've got lots of abandoned sites that have been in that state for 50 years. And over that 50-year time frame, 100 million would become 270 million, just with CPI, just 2%. It's that old compounding effect again. But the miner does something different. He'll discount it by 6 to 10%. So he'll discount that amount over 50 years to about 5 million. Oh, bugger all, who cares? Let's just wait 50 years. It won't cost me anything. What do you think is a realistic value on the rehab at 50 years? Yes. Who said 100 million? Who said 270? I think it'll probably be more. That's why we don't do it. It's too expensive. So there's this increasing divergence between the two. They both think they've reached agreement today on 100 million, but they're thinking very different things about what happens to that money over time. So there's a net present value disincentive in heading towards closure. Okay, let's look at the impact on share prices of a major tailings dam failure, the recent one. Interestingly, when I Googled this, the top one, which is Vale, came up in red. And I'm looking at just the last month, the month from the time of failure, just for the next month. I'm looking at what happened to Vale's share price. It initially went down about 26%. Then, now this is market forces. They're remarkably quick and responsive, and they're not doing high-level analyses. It's just gut feel, really. So there must have been a few people who thought, I think it's dropped further than it might do. I think it's time to buy. So a few people started to buy. Then it went back up about 5%. And then they must have thought, well, then those people sold out so they could get their profit, and other people started losing. It went down again. So the low point, it dropped 26% in 24 hours, but the low point was about a week and a half later when it dropped again. And then it started going up. I'll get to that later. So at the moment, it's even less down. It's less than 10% down on pre-failure values. Now, the next one down is no particular order, but that's BHP. So BHP over a month went up about 15%. There might have been a few other reasons why it went up. Now, notice that it took a bit longer. It took a few days, half a week, to respond to the downturn in Vale's share price. The next one's Rio, about 18% up in a month. Fortescue, the net effect was about 34%, but it was actually, the peak was 40% up. It was 40% up. That little peak you can see there. And it turns out that if you look at the market capitalisation of all iron ore producers in the world, the increase by all the others roughly matched the decrease by Vale. Vale's drop in market capitalisation was about 25 billion US within 24 hours. And that was almost exactly matched by the increase, just took a bit longer to achieve it, almost exactly matched by the increase of the others. This is what drives it, the iron ore price. So look at the 63% ferric iron ore price. Look at the last month. So it was up by 24% over a month. Sorry, it was up to a peak of 24% in that month period. The final rise is about 16%. Now you can actually dissect this. You can explain each of these little rises. So that rise there, which is about 5%, represented the loss of iron ore production from that one mine. 0.5% of the world's supply resulted in a 5% increase in the price of iron ore, a tenfold multiplier effect, which I found is about what it is. So if you reduce your supply and demand equation by 1%, you can affect the price by 10%. Now that's a permanent loss. It's unlikely that mine will ever start again. Then it took a breather. Then Vale announced after about 3 days they were going to voluntarily close a number of their sites temporarily, while I think the word they used was remove the dangerous tailings storage. I don't know how they're going to remove them, but anyway, the response to that was a big increase in price. Then the Brazilian government decided, no, you're going to close a few more. It went up again. Then it flattened off again a little bit until Vale announced for force majeure. We're not able to fulfill our contracts. So people were madly scrambling to fill those contracts. It took about 2 days to do that. They'd filled them, and so over the next few days it dropped down again. It's so responsive. Now you think of the timeline overall. So share prices, the financial markets respond within days, at most a month. After about a month, other things start coming in. So it's a bit hard to tell, but this is a good comparison because the iron ore price was fairly consistent before the failure. The reporting of the result, the various inquiries, because the one I'm not on is only one of them. There are several expert panels that have been set up for various purposes. They'll take months to report. It could be 6 to 9 months, or in the case of Cadia, it's over 12 months. And the legals will go on for at least a decade. And the legals will get probably 90-95% of the fees of all the people involved in those investigations. The lawyers will pick up 90-95% of the total. Let's turn to Mount Polly. So, as I said, it was They call it a soft or a weak layer at depth. It's a glacial deposit. It was overlain by ice, quite a thickness of ice, so it was actually an over-consolidated layer. But if you keep loading it, you'll get to a load where you exceed that over-consolidation, and it then becomes what we call normally consolidated. Now it starts to deform under load a lot more, or a lot faster. So that's essentially what that layer did. And it deformed enough to lose a bit of freeboard, to spill water over the top, which caused the erosion, which then caused this outflow of tailings. Let's look at the impact or the fate of Imperial Metals, which is the parent company of Mount Polley. And Imperial Metals has two mines, Red Chris and Mount Polley. So their peak share price was about $14 Canadian. It's all Canadian, but that's about the same as Australian anyway. So at the time of the failure, their share price dropped by 46%, almost halved the value of the company. And it continued to, it went up a little bit, and then it started going down a bit, and that downtrend was due to the commodity prices falling during that period. So nothing to do with Imperial Metals, really. But the drop from about the start of 2017 onwards was entirely induced by Imperial Metals problems. They got down to a low point. I'll deal with the share price first. So peak of $14, low point of $1. About $7 after the failure, low point of $1. And then Newcrest contracted to buy 70% of Imperial's Red Chris mine. Now, Red Chris is an open pit which is highly prospective to go block cave. But Imperial Metals has no money. So they needed someone with block cave experience, which is Cadia, and they want someone with enough money to buy out part of the operation. So they bought 70%. Wisely, Imperial Metals kept 30% of the value, so they'd benefit as well. So it was looked on well, and the share price went up about 70%. Now, so I've got some of that in this slide, but Imperial Metals is currently surviving on debt. With $75 million per year in interest payments, they don't have the money, so they're covering it by giving shares to their creditors, which is the reason why their share price went down to $1. Their failure cleanup cost was about 70-odd million Canadian, not counting 12 months of lost production. So they lost cash flow as well. I don't know how big that was, but they lost that cash flow. So it was probably double that amount. The environmental liabilities were costed at 174 million, but they were discounted, of course, over time. I don't know what the time period is, but they had discounted them to now to about 100 million. But they only had about 14 million in cash. It was a liability, they didn't have the money. An estimated 86 million Canadian is expected to be spent on Mount Polley between 2018 and I don't know where they get the 2046, but it's a long way out there. So discounting probably helps. Leaving an undiscounted liability post 2046 of about 100 million Canadian, which they currently don't have. Do you get the picture? Don't get in this situation. So the Cadia tailings dam failure. So this did not go outside the tailings footprint. It did cause a cessation of tailings deposition in the tailings dams, and they then went in pit for a period. The government approved that very quickly. Why do you think the government would quickly approve them a sudden change of course going into the pit? Why do you think that was? Royalties, I think. I'm not sure. I might be wrong. Let's look at Newcrest share price. So that's over a long period of time. That's the Cadia tailings dam failure. I think they lost about 15% of shareholder value, but it was quickly recovered. And if you look at their buying of 70% of Red Chris, that was looked unfavourably by the market as well. So the market, this is a good example of a win-win. Newcrest is looking good because of this purchase, and Red Chris or Imperial Metals also looking good. So some examples. I'm going to talk about the apple skin of covers. I'm going to talk about slope treatment, capping surface and in-pit tailings, and some closure lessons. So a lot of these examples are not tailings because we've done far less at rehabilitating tailings. We've done a lot more of waste rock dumps. But the principles about covers and so on are similar. Partly the reason why we haven't done tailings is that tailings cover a big footprint. You take a typical metalliferous mine, you might find that the tailings, if they're a surface tailing storage, will occupy maybe half the footprint that's disturbed. The waste rock dumps will be maybe a third, and the pit will be the rest. The pit's relatively small. So big footprint, big cost. But just looking at the performance of covers, so there are two schools of thought. Do we shed rainfall, or do we try and store it on the top in a cover that doesn't allow too much to go through? Now, in fact, every cover type has some store and release function. If it didn't have that, you couldn't support vegetation. So any cover thickness will give you some store of water, which will sustain vegetation. The difference is that with a proper store and release cover, you don't allow runoff at all. You make sure that the surface ponds the water on top. It doesn't spill over the top. So these two examples, these are Queensland rivals. So this is Mount Lation, the eroding rainfall shedding cover, and this is Kidston. So Mount Lation went for a conventional rainfall shedding thing where first of all, they shed all the rainfall from the top of the dump, or it could be the top of the tailing storage, over the side slopes. So if you do that, just looking at that roughly, maybe 90% of the footprint, or maybe a little less than 90, but let's say it's 90. Let's say 90% of the footprint is the top and 10% is the side, roughly. It would have been when it was angle of repose, but they've made it flatter. So that means that you're multiplying, if you shed all of this over the side, you're multiplying the runoff that goes over the side by a factor of 10, roughly. Now you look at those contour drains and downslope drains, and they occupy less than 10% of the slope. So you're multiplying the runoff again by another factor of 10. So now you're expecting a 10 mil rainfall event, which will convert to a metre of runoff, can be handled in your downslope drains. And it can't. It can't for several reasons. I mean, the contour drains will fail. They'll overtop or they'll pipe. Some of them won't even deliver water to the downslope drains. The downslope drains are often not properly proportioned so that Mother Nature decides, no, I think it's easier to just erode the side of the downslope drain, not jump into it. So I'm just going to make a gigantic gully either side of the downslope drain, or I'll make it somewhere else, wherever there's a low point. So they do that. So the point is they fail, and it's not surprising. And a waste rock dump or a tailings storage facility will suffer differential settlement. You won't be able to construct it perfectly anyway. You've got relatively flat slopes on your drains that deliver water to the downslope drain. They will fail. You don't see natural slopes with contour banks unless you've got a distinct change of material. They're only temporary at best, so they will fail. Now, if I were to magnify that, you'd see how badly it failed, but I think you can see by how messy those drains are that it clearly didn't work. Whereas this one's performing quite well. It's robust. None of the water on the top is shed over the side. The side is left at angle of repose, but they've overdumped fines on it. They're actually oxide because they don't have topsoil. And then they've aerially seeded the whole lot. They could have got onto the top to seed it by hand, but they aerially seed the slopes. It's the only way to get onto them. Now, I'm not saying this is the answer. I'm certainly not saying this is not the answer. I'm just saying that you need to bear this in mind if you're considering those two options and how they might perform. So this is the overdumping at Kidston. So they found their oxide material, which is the closest thing they had to topsoil. And thou shalt put topsoil on a steep slope so that it washes down to the bottom, No, so that it vegetates. So they decided, they did trials that showed that it didn't matter what angle you put that oxide at. If it was appreciable, it would erode. It would erode faster than it would vegetate. So they decided they'd use nature. They just overdump the crest. It would form an oversteepened wedge of fine material. It would wash down over time. Don't put so much that it all ends up at the bottom. You just put enough so that it'll fill up the voids in the course. It'll retain water. It'll then sustain some vegetation. And you aerially seed that. And so it rotates from looking like that in the wet season to looking brown or parched in the dry season. Just rotates between the two. There are other solutions too. A lot of people have used rocky mulch. Look at your natural analogues. If you've got a slope steeper than about 8 degrees or so, you'll probably find a predominance of shrubs and trees on a slope of more than 8 degrees, whereas on the flat you'll see a predominance of grasses. Why would you expect grasses to grow on a slope that's 8 degrees or more when nature doesn't do that? And the reason it doesn't do that is you can't retain enough moisture on a steep slope near to the surface to supply the roots of grass, because grass roots only fairly shallow. You'll end up with shrubs and trees. They'll do it in nature anyway. I want to say a little bit about this is actually Wombo, so some of you might be familiar with this one. So they had, one of their seams was particularly smectite, clay rich. So sodium smectite, the worst clay you can get. Swelling clay, doesn't settle. They decided to put most of the tailings from this, the washing of this seam, into a pit, into an in-pit tailing storage. It measured about 24 hectares. They had a consultant advise them on how they might attempt to cover this, which involved geotextile. First, anchor the geotextile on one side of the pit and go across the pit. They dragged it across in a boat and rolled it out. They anchored it on the other side. They came back and forth, back and forth. Then they needed to cable tie the strips of geotextile together, because otherwise the gloop would come up in between. They sat on their head, guys sitting on their bums, going across, cable tying at 6-inch intervals or 150 mil intervals. Then they put geogrid over the top. Now they couldn't use the boat anymore because they would have ripped the geotextile, so they had to roll that out on their bums across the slope, anchor it one side, roll it out, anchor the other side, come back, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. Cable tie all of that at 150 mil centres. They decided that wasn't quite enough, so they ran the geogrid the other way, the lengthwise as well, did the same thing. Then they started placing fill, which was to be placed in 300 mil layers, 2 300 mil layers, and then you might be able to get a bit more beyond that. Essentially, the fill will displace water. So you don't actually make much headway, you just displace water ahead of you. They pushed that out using D2s, the equivalent of a drot. They spent most of their time tracking back and forth. And you can see that they're still getting a mess. This has all been treated with the geotextile and the geogrid. They're getting a mess ahead of them. It's not exactly bow waving, it's more an ooze wave ahead of them. They gave up. Now, if they'd been able to do that, if they'd been able to complete it, it would have cost about $1 million a hectare. Can you think of any other way to do it? How else would you cover this? No. The reason why you can't use wicks is you've got to get out onto it first, and you've got to be able to load it to reduce the pore pressure to get the wicks to drain. You could do it hydraulically. So you, instead of pumping, we do co-disposal in various places, coarse reject plus tailings in coal. That's been done for since about 1990. We don't do it well. We tend to pump at too high velocity and too low percent solids, but anyway, we do it. So instead of pumping the combined thing, just pump the coarse reject. And you'll form an alluvial fan. If you go to Death Valley, you'll see alluvial fans. They have a slope of about 1 in 8. You can create an alluvial fan of coarse reject, which will form an alluvial fan of about 1 in 10. And as it forms, so you'll have a slope at 1 in 10. You just keep moving it out. Keep the discharge point moving out over your 1 in 10 alluvial fan. Then you create a layer of free draining material over the top. And you make it 1 or even 2 metres thick if you need to. That's your construction platform. Once you've got that, you can probably then go to a D10. Or if you can't do it with that, you just put a bit more out by pumping. You don't fail a tailings beach by adding another layer of tailings. And equally, you won't fail it by adding a layer of coarse reject either. So you could create a cover hydraulically. Now this is New Auckland. This is the surface tailings storage facility, and they were able to do this by pushing out about 1 metre of coarse reject with a D6 swamp dozer. They left it for a while to dry, you know, and most of it dried, but the wetter areas weren't particularly dry. So as you get to the wetter areas, you have to be a bit more cautious. Anyway, this was able to be achieved. Where it got a bit wetter, you had to be a bit more careful. Bottom left-hand corner, you've got a little rivulet of water coming out. So that at this location, the water table was about 1 metre below the surface. You added 1 metre of reject. The weight of that was about 1.8 metres of water head, if you like, 18 kPa. That was enough to bring the water table to the surface. And that's what you're seeing there. The water is draining away. You want to avoid the next one, the one at the bottom in the middle, where the first thing you see happening is hydraulic fracturing through that crust that you formed, because the crust is lower permeability than the material below. It's all trying to drain. It can't drain quickly enough through the crust, so it cracks it. Hydraulic fracturing. The next thing you see, if you keep pushing it, you start generating a bow wave failure. When you get a bow wave failure, you convert the tailing strength from the peak strength to a remolded strength, because you're remolding, and that's about typically 1/3 to 1/2 of the peak strength. That's why you get this sudden bow wave that occurs. You get a sudden failure. So this was, the problems were avoided by, we tested in advance of the toe of this using a vane shear. So we got an idea of the strength. We knew how much we could put on safely. And if there was a problem, we didn't always push out like a roadway like that. In most cases, we were pushing out a broad front, and we just kept pushing out and came back to the start. By the time we came back to the start, consolidation had taken place. It was now stronger. We could push more. So this is how it looked over time. That was before capping. Now you'll see the white areas. The white areas were actually spoil. So they thought, this is a short haul. We can dump spoil on this tailings dam. And they kept doing that until they generated a bow wave that went 60 metres out and threatened to go over the lip of the dam at the other side. So they stopped doing it. And then we later came in and we did this. So you can see that they've advanced the fill quite well. So it was a metre of coarse reject with a D6, and then they could then place on top of that 2 to 3 metres using a D9 of spoil material. And then finally you had to put topsoil on it, but it was relatively flat, so it didn't erode. A bit further advanced, and that's essentially what it's looking like now. So they were able to successfully cap this. This is one of the few coal facilities in the East Coast, at least. They've done it in Collie, I think, but one of the few on the East Coast they've actually capped, and quite successfully. Now, what do you do when you've got a pit? You've got in-pit tailings. Well, in fact, that's hydraulic placement, but that's co-disposal. That's coarse reject plus tailings. And that's at Gibberapilly in Ipswich, which is where it was first used in Australia. Now, you could do it hydraulically. You could hydraulically place over in-pit tailings. Or you could do it by this method, in dumping from the high wall. And if you're using waste materials that would otherwise go into a dump somewhere, you're not losing anything. Don't use erodible spoil or degradable spoil, because that defeats the purpose. You're then adding slop to slop, or you're adding material that will become slop. Add something like coarse reject. And why is coarse reject coarse reject? Because it's gone through a wash plant and it didn't break down. So it's more durable than the stuff that became tailings. So if you've got coarse reject available, do that. What would you get? Well, it will go into the tailings, and this works perfectly well if you've got water over the top. It'll go into the tailings to find its own level. You'll have a mixing zone. You'll have consolidating tailings below that mixing zone. You'll have clean fill above it. And it's actually easy to do. So here's an example. This is their in-pit. So the top left-hand one is before they started. The next one, you can see they pushed out from the high wall quite successfully. They've also pushed out from the dry end of the beach. The problematic bit is in the middle, where they just left it for a while to dry. No progressive crusting or beaching. Thin crust, and that became problematic. And you see they continued to push from the high wall end quite successfully. They eventually capped the slop in the middle, but they had to do that much more carefully, much more gently. So it can be done. Similar sort of price. There are other solutions too, not really applicable to this part of the world, but in Tasmania, here's an example of a peat and water cover over tailings. Here's an example from another dry climate. This is San Manuel copper mine in Arizona. That tailings slope is 100 metres high. It had been flattened off or created at about 1 in 3, so the slope is 300 metres long. Their plan originally was to have contour banks and downslope drains, and I was asked to review this and talk them out of that. What I wanted them to do was, they had rock available from a nearby quarry. What I wanted them to do was put an underlay of alluvium, but I knew that was erodible, and then put an overlay of crushed rock over the top. They decided to spend the same amount of money they originally planned to spend, and that only gave them enough money to cover the lower 2/3 with rock, so that's what they did. Not the perfect solution, but it's actually worked quite well. So here's a shot. There's a shot first. The bigger one is when they were first doing it, then 2 years later, and now 12 years later. It's actually worked quite well. And it's actually vegetated better than they imagined it would, with minimal erosion. So some lessons. Have a clear closure aim in harmony with the surroundings and plan and actively operate to facilitate this. Question the net present value approach applied to even operations if they're long term, and certainly to closure costing. The environmental conditions pertain to operations. They're largely imposed due to a mistrust that the environment will be protected during operations. They're not closure criteria, so don't work to them. Zero discharge and sediment containment create legacies, and they're not feasible post-closure, and certainly not in perpetuity. Aim for mine lease relinquishment, operations that facilitate this. A viable post-closure land use or ecological function if there's not a value-added land use. Rehabilitate in a way that facilitates, not inhibits, future land use. And liaise with the ultimate custodians of the land, whoever they happen to be, maybe not just the regulators. Question the conventional, this is what we've always done. Take all of the site conditions, the site setting into account, climate, topography, seismicity, nature of mining, processing waste. The climate and the topography, and if there is seismicity, will ultimately govern in perpetuity because you're not operating anymore. So treat mining and processing waste as potential construction or rehabilitation materials and segregate them out. So if you work out what proportion of, if you think about a cover, let's say the cover is 1 metre thick, and you look at your total disturbed footprint and you work out what the total volume would be for that 1 metre. Well, you can do it another way. How deep is your pit in proportion to 1 metre over your footprint that's disturbed? Just look at the simple mass balance. How much good material do I need to find from my materials I take out of the pit to be able to rehabilitate without sourcing from outside? And you'll find it's minuscule. It's a very small proportion of the total mine material. So if you can find material that's suitable, stockpile it. Identify, segregate and encapsulate potentially contaminating waste. Thank you.
I know you'll have some additional questions for David, but we thought we'd just wait for the panel Q&A session at the end of the day to ask those questions. So jot them down so you don't forget. That would be good. Now we've got Matthew Newton, who's going to facilitate a workshop think tank on key risks and controls for tailings management. Thanks.
Okay, so this morning you heard from the regulators in terms of what our expectations are. You've now heard from David in terms of what's leading practice tailings management look like, what's some of the opportunities. So now it's over to you. So what we want to get out of this session is industry are the innovators, you're the experts. We really want some really good feedback from you in terms of what's working well, what's not working well, what are some potential pathways we can do collectively to actually address some of these key issues on site. So the way we thought we would do this is by a SWOT analysis. So the theme here is adoption of leading practice tailings management across industry. And that, I think, sometimes need to be thought about outside conventional techniques. The objectives are safe facilities, sustainable rehab outcomes and non-polluting. That's what we're trying to achieve. So we thought we'd do this via SWOT. So looking at the strengths, so for example, what is industry doing well? For example, how they manage key risks and controls. We may have some sites here that are doing it quite well and sitting with others who are tackling similar issues in the site. Be very interested to see what you're doing. And what the regulator is doing well. We're fantastic, as everybody knows. Weaknesses. What's industry and regulators not doing well? And I'm probably expecting to see a lot of things about the regulator in terms of why they're not doing well, but very keen to actually understand that. Opportunities. What are the opportunities to improve from both an industry and a regulator perspective? And what are the threats? What are the barriers, threats to implementing leading practice management, e.g. lack of planning and expertise? What are we trying to get out of this? Well, we're going to collate all the information from the SWOT analysis. We'll go away and have a bit of a think about that, but we're also going to utilise the SWOT analysis as a bit of a feedback session into the panel session this afternoon. So really what I want to extract out of you is what do you see as industry as a pathway forward to actually address some of these issues? So regulators who have been actually assign a table, can we just go down the back to Darlene to pick up butcher's paper and texters? If they go around and sit on each of the tables. And just remember to actually write on the top of the butcher's paper in terms of what you're considering, whether it's a strength, weakness, etc. We'll have, Sal, we've got an hour here, have we? We've got 1 hour to do this. We'll have some afternoon tea, come back and we'll finish off with a panel session.